Hey, YouTube folks. Welcome to another video on this Chessy channel. And in today's video, yes, we're continuing our coverage of the 6th round of the World Championship. And today, I'll get straight to the point. There's no other way to describe what happened here in the 6th round except with the words war battle. A real tension. One of the most dramatic games I've ever seen in my life. And this game had everything. Time pressure, both sides under stress, a quality sacrifice, a real war. And I'm warning you now. One of the two players scores the first point today in the World Championship. Who was it, little Raphael, who took the lead? Hold on to your seat, get your popcorn ready, and let's get to the battle, because that's what the World Championship is now. Stop. Woohoo! So guys, here we are. And playing white was the Norwegian Magnus Carlsen against the Russian Nepomniachtchi. Magnus opens with d4 playing solidly. Nepo responds with knight to c6, then knight to f3 and d5. Here, Magnus doesn't proceed. For super theoretical lines, he plays a double fianchetto here. Here's how the game will proceed. g3, e6, bg2, b7 castle, secure the kings, then b3. Look, Magnus is getting ready too. After fianchettoing the bishop on d2, the b2 bishop followed. Next, c5 targets the center. After capturing, bishop takes c4 for more contact. Magnus Carlsen plays 2, then qc2. Here, there's a very logical idea that you can't take the pawn because otherwise, oops, it's falling. The bishop, Nepo, defended with queen to e7. The bishop is now safe, and Magnus plays knight b to d2, a super dynamic pawn sacrifice. On the b3 square to play here for compensation, right? Because if you take, I'll have better development. Attacks the bishop, bishop 6 of 4 white has compensation here. The pieces are developing, and a tactical theme is emerging on the diagonal. Because of that, after knight from b to d2 Nepo didn't do that, he played a stronger move. Stockfish's top move is knight to c6, but he doesn't choose it. Not in the dynamic play Magnus proposed to win with white. So then knight takes c4 was played by the Norwegian, b5, a super aggressive move. Notice it also highlights some themes along the diagonal. Everything is calculated by Nepo. Then the Norwegian plays knight to e5, offering exchanges followed by knight to b4. It's already getting uncomfortable for white. Magnus will try to reorganize now. He played queen to b2 and bishop to e7 as Nepo fought for the long diagonal. Then a 3 drove away the knight on c6, followed by knight to d3. Now Magnus, oops, he touches. Bishop to c5, then b6. Then g5 was played, developing the last piece and pinning the knight on f6, followed by rook to d8. Played here by the Russian. And at this moment, Magnus makes a very practical move. Bishop takes f6. He wants Nepo to capture with the queen and enter an endgame. This Norwegian is known for being crafty and strong in endgames. Nepo said, no, nothing like that, and he took with the pawn. That's an interesting but risky decision, as it exposes his king further and leaves a weak pawn structure on the f-file. Magnus responded with rook to c1, then knight to d4, improving the knight's position. Magnus exchanged pieces, knight takes, bishop takes, then queen to a2 to defend the a3 pawn. Bishop took on g2, king recaptured, queen moved to b7 with check, king returned to g1, then queen played e4. Here, Nepo tries to find more activity for his queen, so queen to c2 was played by Magnus. A plan he might be provoking here. Rook to a8 is an idea since Nepo may contest the file. Still, be cautious. Because I might have the option here to trade a queen for 2 rooks. And usually, the 2 rooks are a bit stronger than the queen. a5 was played, giving Nepo more queenside space. Rook f to d1 puts it on the g7 file, then rook to d2, and Magnus hints he might act. He's getting ready to double on the d file. The Russian just made his move, right? Rook to a8, c8. Look at that, Nepo plays this idea. Notice that he already moved the king away from any check threats, right? And in this position, then, he is indeed offering. The Norwegian accepted the queen for 2 rooks trade. Rook takes 8, rook takes 8, then queen to 5. Nepo is now pressuring Magnus's pawns on b3 and b4. One idea is Magnus might try to put the knight on d5. Then Nepomniachtchi played a4. He fixes both of Magnus's pawns on dark squares and has the dark squared bishop, starting to build tension. Here, the Russian can bring the bishop in if white makes a mistake. So e3 was played, and at this point, both players here, especially Magnus, he was running out of time, which really caught the attention of those watching live. Nepo. Here, he plays bishop to e5. He played a bold line here, leading to a dynamic game and risking almost everything with the black pieces, right? That would be the move bishop to b2, which was a very interesting line here for black, okay? Why? If you take with the knight, the rook is hanging, that's very clear. And if you take with the rook, then white is lost here. Now I play queen takes d3, threatening to win the pawn on a3. Defending causes you to lose, since queen moves to b1. This was an interesting line. For Nepo, what I showed is just a variation to illustrate the tactical themes. White isn't forced to play this way, but Nepo didn't want to get into this dynamic. He was trying to put pressure on Magnus with the clock, played bishop e5, keeping the tension. h4 played by Magnus Carlsen, h5. Nepo adjusts the king side and plays king h2, then bishop d2 is played here. It's important to note Magnus had only about 30 seconds here. About that on the clock, so Nepo now, yes. He went into the super risky line to try to make Magnus get into time trouble or not have enough time to solve the problems. Because the ideas are very similar. If you take with the knight, the rook falls, and if you take with the rook, I take the knight, and now I'm threatening the little pawn on a3. Nepo played at the right time, largely due to time pressure, opting for rook to 5. Here Magnus makes a very strong move, queen to d6, keeping the theme of the pinned knight, right? Here, rook to d1 was played, threatening to win the bishop. The issue is Nepo has bishop takes a3, while Magnus was still under heavy time pressure. He's trying to get here, close to reaching here, close to move 40, remembering that he's on move 33. Here, there are 7 moves left, and he had very little time on the clock, so here. Magnus plays, rook takes b5, and is already losing in this position. And queen to d7, that's Nepo's move, attacking the rook on b5. Now that's the move Nepo played here in this position. Magnus moves the rook to c2, then Nepo plays the queen to d5. They're on move 36, nearing the 40 move time control to get another hour. Nepo played this move but missed the interesting idea of bishop takes b4. He spent some time here. He didn't want this variation since taking loses the exchange and leaves a tough position to defend. With white, okay? No, the game isn't decided yet, but it's better for black. Magnus would have to play rook to c1 here, controlling the rook, and he would play this position a pawn down. However, Nepo chose a different move. He moved his queen to d5 to maintain tension and prepare to invade on b3. Magnus then doubled up on the second rank, defending here while under time pressure. Queen to b3 by Russian Pora on a2, now e4 attacks the knight in both spots. Magnus finds a very good continuation, and now Magnus is the one who starts to get the advantage. They were both short on time and already playing blitz. In the World Championship, he played knight to c5. Queen takes b4, and Magnus then made a small inaccuracy with knight takes e4. This leads to the idea that if Nepo takes, the bishop hangs and it becomes an exchange. The rook endgame favors white, since after this capture and rook takes on a3, the a4 pawn will fall, and white can win this game. But here Magnus had a stronger idea, which he had. With a little time left, I missed seeing the move rook to c2. And the idea of this move is to defend the knight and keep the queen here, locked in defending the bishop. So it would be very hard for black to break free here, and white would have a slight advantage in this position. When Magnus received 60 minutes at move 40, he could have pressed, but missed the move due to having little time left. Nepo played knight takes e4 queen to b3, then rook to a2. And here they get an extra hour, right? To continue the game until the end. So bishop to f8, Nepo moves his bishop back, preparing to push his passed pawn from the second rank, but it won't succeed. The rooks are active. Magnus plays knight to c5, then queen to b5. Nepo must be careful. He must never trade the bishop for the knight at any point in this endgame. Because this endgame here, rooks against the queen, is winning for white, because at some point white can set up a doubled structure here. Capture the a-pawn, then the h-pawn, and black can't do much. The Russian realized this. After knight to 5, he didn't trade, but played queen to 5, followed by knight to d3 from Magnus Carlsen. Going back to a3, the passed pawn keeps advancing. Knight to f4, now poking at the little pawn. Moves like rook to 5 and queen to a5 can occur. Why is this move provocative? What if you play rook to d5? Be careful with this move, as the passed pawn could become very strong. Nepo could play queen to 6, and if you take this pawn, I'll push the a2 pawn and you can't stop it. I'll never win with black pieces again. Magnus defended, blocked the passed pawn, showed endgame skill, played bishop to b4, then accidentally touched the rook and moved it to d3. Now Magnus will try to create something. To make his three pieces, the two rooks and the knight, put pressure on the a3 pawn. If that pawn falls, Magnus can try to win this endgame, and he's trying now. King h6 was just played. And you guys must be shouting over there, just like the people who are watching live. Raphael, why didn't Magnus play rook to e5 in this position? He won't win the h-pawn, so we must always remember the a-pawn is very far advanced. Nepo plays queen to a4. If knight takes h5 with check, I move king to h6, knight to f6, then queen to b3. And here, black is winning because I attack the rook, and the rook can't go back to d2. The bishop is controlling. If rook to the first rank, then I play bishop to c3 and push the pawn and promote, so here black is very, very winning. After bishop to 4, Magno played rook to d3, continued with king to h6, controlling the pawn, then moved rook to d1. Now he's going to try to set up to apply pressure. Here, pawn to a3, queen to a4, attacks rook. Rook to ad1, bishop to d6. Now they begin making moves as Magnus prepares his pieces to attack. a3, then king g1, queen. b3, Nepo keeps improving his queen's position. It's dramatic. In the end, knight to e2, Magnus plans to move the knight from d4 to c2, win the a3 pawn, and press in the endgame. Is it really that easy? No? The Russian plays chess very well. He played queen to d3, and now Magnus plays knight d4, king to e7. Nepo is making his move, defending this endgame, right? So the little pawn on a doesn't fall, king h2 played by the Norwegian queen to e4, and that's a sneaky move. Why? Is Nepo threatening the queen with h4 now? There's a pin theme with the pawn on g3. But here Magnus plays a move, a brilliant idea. The number one move according to Stockfish. It's a very hard move to make. You need strong endgame knowledge to play like Magnus did here. It's risky, but in the World Championship, risks are necessary. He played rook takes a3, look at that move. And the idea is, if I take here, I'll be down the exchange. Knight and rook against the queen. But there are many positions here where white wins. I can move the knight to f4 to pressure this pawn, bring the rook over, and no one will defend it anymore. So very, very risky. However, nevertheless, Nepo didn't let that happen. He plays the move here that keeps the most tension in the position. He played queen takes h4 using the g-pawn pin. Magnus moved his king to g1. Queen to e4 was played. Let's finish this endgame. Magnus will now defend his rook and plays rook to a4. Notice this move now threatens the queen directly. Now bishop to e5 was played, pinning the knight, and in this position, Magnus moves that knight, so knight to e2. This move creates a discovered attack on the queen. Also note that both players are low on time again. Time is crucial in this match. Queen to c2, rook to a2 attacks the queen. Queen to b3, then king to g2. Now they're starting to get organized. Magno is pressing in this endgame while Nepo defends. Queen to f5, check on f3. And here comes one of the most dramatic moments. The game is tied. If you put it in the engine, it's going to show 0-0 here because now Magno leaves the second rank a bit more vulnerable. Of course, the rook is still defending here. But for someone who's trying to win, the endgame can be very tough because at some point, a lot of check threats can come up. Queen to d1 was played. Nepo keeps pressing, aiming to activate his queen with f4. Magnus moves, forcing the bishop off the comfortable e5 square. Bishop goes to c7 king. To f2, Magnus defends and improves his king's position. Bishop to b6 was played, pressuring the e3 pawn, a key theme in this game. Rook to a1 attacking the queen, queen to b3, rook to e4. Magnus now defends against Nepo's strong threat on e3. The Russian played king to g7, then rook to e8. Magnus is preparing to invade the 8th rank, probing the position. The game is drawn. With little time left, Magnus begins pressing in this dramatic endgame. Then f5 was played, and now Magnus plays rook to a8, preparing several check threats here on g8. Then queen to b4 was played. Nepo keeps fighting back and creating counterplay. If you play rook to f8, I can eventually capture. Rook to c8 was played here by the Norwegian. Bishop to a5, and in this position, rook to c1 Magnus is just making moves, basically trying to complicate things for one, trying to complicate things for the other. Then bishop to bishop was played. b6 pressures the e3 pawn again. Rook e5, then queen b3. And in this position, rook to e8 Magnus again just makes a move. Queen to 5 was played. The game continues with rook to c8 and queen to h1, shifting the queen to the other side. They prepared checks with queen to 2, rook to c1. Magnus chased the queen away. She returned to d5, then rook to b. It was tense to watch live as they were just circling and making moves without a clear goal. They're waiting for one of them to make a mistake. Bishop to a7, now played by the Russian, rook to e7. Be careful, Magnus is planning an invasion here. On the 7th rank, Nepo plays bishop to c5, attacking the rook. Rook to e5, queen to d3, and finally rook to b7. Magnus again begins creating potential threats here. On the 7th, queen to c2 was played, then rook to b5, giving Magnus a slight advantage. What is that advantage, Rafa? Notice he attacks the bishop. If the bishop moves, he wins the f5 pawn. He's made some progress here. Through these moves that seemed like he was repeating, but no, he was making progress little by little. Then came bishop to a7, and here Magnus could already play rook takes f5, but he didn't take it. He makes a few moves to gain time on the clock, earning 30 seconds for each move. So he keeps playing to increase his time. Rook to 5, supports bishop, bishop to 6, then rook to b5, bishop to a7, rook takes 5. He repeats this to gain time. Nepo plays queen to d3, adding pressure. Magnus gains a pawn, rook captures on f7. Here's the drama. Look at this move. This move is a very, very, very strong and interesting move. Notice here that Magnus is sacrificing the exchange. He plays rook takes f7, then rook b7 to capture the bishop, aiming for a rook and knight endgame against the queen with 2 passed pawns. This is a very dangerous move. It could win the game, but I could also get into trouble and end up losing, right? He played rook takes f7, king takes f7, rook b7 king, g6, then rook takes a7. Now Magnus's mission is to advance the pawns from here. There are 2 passed pawns, but Nepo defends amazingly. Watch, queen to 5. Nepo's main goal is to control e4 unless Magnus pushes it. Winning this game is impossible. Rook to 6 check. King to h7, rook to a1. Just like Armando said, then king to g6. Nepo will keep moving the knight to d4, centralizing and always control e4, while Magnus played rook to a2 to control the 2nd rank. Because there's a Russian trick, you can always lose a game that's supposed to be a draw. The game. Magnus played rook to a2 to defend queen h1, bringing the queen back and threatening the Norwegian's rook. Magnus checked, king f7, then knight f3 to improve its position. The knight now defends several squares. Nepo's queen is trapped, but queen bum brought her back into play. Rook to d6, king to g7. Nepo plays rook to d5, queen to a2. Check is check, rook to d2, returning to avoid losing the threatened rook. The drama on d5 continues. Queen b1, then rook e2. Magnus has prepared the advance, as the Russian did. He discovered an excellent way to defend this position. Queen 6, look again. He defends the e4 pawn advance. Magno plays rook c2, circling again. Queen 1 attacks the rook, then knight d4 is played to defend the queen's rook. On h1, queen moves across, rook to c7 king to f6. Rook to c6, king to f7, knight to f3. It was played, returning to a similar position with the queen on b1. Nepo seems to want to repeat, as a draw favors him. With black and knight to g5, Magnus checks and advances the knight. Notice that this move can, at some point, support e4. It's not very good, but this advance was played. King g7 knight. King g7 knight 6. Check again. King f7 knight d4. Magnus keeps searching for a plan, but can't find one. Nepo just played queen h1. Watching the rook on c6 and remembering c6. The Achilles heel of the Norwegian. Boom, rook to c7, check again. King to f6, knight to f3, queen to b1, rook to d7, and now comes the move queen to b2. So Magnus brings the rook back to d2. Notice that this position has already repeated once. Queen to b1 was played, knight to g1. Magnus keeps trying to improve his pieces. The plan isn't clear yet. He wants to advance, but he can't. Nepo is always defending, and queen to b4 was just played, attacking the rook in this position. Rook to d1 was played, defending. Queen to b3 attacks the rook again, rook to d6, check. The king goes back to g7, rook to d4. And here's a very important point. It's a position that Magnus was already trying to plan for, which is to make the move. Knight to d2 is a key position. After queen to b2 and knight to d2, Nepo plays queen to b1. Again, keeping an eye on the e4 pawn, but here Magnus managed to get a new formation. The rook defends the advance and the rook is no longer hanging because the knight defends the rook. And now he plays bishop e4, and from here, desperation starts on all sides. Nepo played queen h1, then rook d7. Check king g8. Rook d4, queen h2 check, and king e3. Magnus plans to advance with h4. Nepo tries to sacrifice his pawn, since if it falls, Magnus gets 3 passed pawns. Drama. So Magnus took with queen h3 check, king d2 was played, queen takes h4, and now Magnus is going to try to work. This endgame is absolutely won. No, this position is a draw, but it's very hard to play. It's important to point out that both players here had around 3 minutes on the clock. Of course, they were playing with a 30-second increment. How does the fight continue now? Magnus Carlsen played rook to d3. The knight defends the f4 pawn king to f8 rook to f3, ready to attack. Queen to d8 check. King to e3, queen to a5, king to f2, queen to a7, rook to e3 covering the check. And after the move queen to d7, Magnus plays knight to g3 and he keeps consolidating his position. Queen d2 check, king f3 forced, queen d1 check, rook e2 covers. Queen b3, so many checks. Black aims to create a perpetual by continuously checking for the rest of the game. King to g2, queen to b7, rook to d2, the Norwegian keeps working. Endgame monster, by the way. Queen to b3 was played, rook to d5, king, rook to d5, king to e7. And now comes the check. The king goes to f7, rook to f5 check again, king to e8, and now boom, another little advance. The passed pawn has a sole life. In the World Championship, queen to d2 was played, check, then king to e3. Magnus hides his king on the king's side, queen to e6, king to e4, the king advances. Now it's much more dramatic. Check and the knight goes to d5. And here is one of the most dramatic moments. It's very hard to play this position because now Nepo doesn't really have a way to hold the pawns. Queen to 7. He played attacking the rook, but notice here that this move doesn't bring any threat. If you take the rook, I play knight to g7 for a fork. Crazy, right? But now you can't do that because the knight is pinned. So he played e6, Magnus pushes the pawn, preparing and now threatening the rook on f7. Queen to g6 was played, and then rook to f7. Here comes more drama. Nepo can't take the pawn on g6 or he'll lose the endgame. I play with check, take, and I have one extra pawn. That pawn wins the game, that's enough. So here king d8 was played, Nepo tries to escape with his king, and Magnus plays f5 and the pawns keep advancing more and more. Queen g1 was played. And here, in this dramatic and fateful moment, the Norwegian plays knight to g7 and now threatens to check and promote, and there's no way to defend against this idea anymore. Because of this, the Russian Jan Nepomniachtchi resigned from this dramatic game after no less than 136 moves. What happened here was a war. The players fought the entire time. This game started at 9:30 in the morning and ended around 6 in the evening, an extremely long game. The players were very tired here, and that's what I noticed, and that's how I define this game. Both players play a lot of chess. It's not just chess that won. But what ended up prevailing here was the spirit to win. And today, that victorious spirit belonged to the Norwegian. Magnus pressed on tirelessly. He kept hitting one after another until at one point the Russian's guard dropped and a blow landed. Magnus wins in a dramatic finish, a real adrenaline rush. Watching this live, look at the updated scoreboard up there. The match at this moment goes to 3.54. Magnus Carlsen takes the lead over the Russians 2.5 points. Remember that tomorrow is the 7th round. Nepo is now coming at Magnus anyway, trying to tie the competition. Look at the accuracy of this game. 95.0, super high pressure for a game of 136 moves. 91.3 was the Russians' accuracy. Notice it gives a brilliant move for Magnus, which was correct. The move, rook takes a3 when Magnus sacrificed. I also want to point out here that rook takes f7 was very, very strong, leading to this endgame, which was drawn. There was time pressure, and it got tight. But that's part of the struggle, which is what chess is, as I always say. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, and we'll keep fighting in the World Championship until the next videos. We're in this together, guys.